tied to our family for over 15 years. Through fun times, sad times, the Pickle family has been there for both my mom and Richard. It is with great pleasure that I introduce to you my friend, Richard's co-author and an honorary Klein family member, Lyn Pickle.
My kids were laughing back there saying, "Oh, thank God the microphone didn't go out on you, because you would have totally collapsed at that point." Also, nobody has ever accused me of having a soft voice, so I'm assuming those of you in the back can hear me. Richard Klein, more than any other individual I have ever encountered, was not constricted by all the usual boundaries that tie us to convention in life. Truth be told, I'm not certain that Richard would have recognized a boundary if he had been bitten by one. But that, as we all know, is precisely what endeared us to Richard Klein, the man of a million wonderful and sometimes wacky ideas. There was no such word as impossible in Richard's vocabulary. Pre-sell cemetery plots to Protestant and Jewish families? Well, sure, because it just so happens that Richard has been sitting Shiva, going to wakes, and creating family trees with the relatives of the deceased in that part of town already. So he practically knows everybody in that part of town. Besides, he has this wonderful idea. He's going to see if the housewives might be interested in pre-buying a plot in exchange for 500 S&H green stamps. Now, do you know just what 500 S&H green stamps will buy? Well, there's only one small problem. It's the early 1960s, and in those days, it's the husband, not the wife, that signs the dotted line. No problem. When you get to the house, you have the guy fix himself a drink. A stiff one, no pun intended. And you have the guy lie down on the couch in a prone position, and you have him take off his shoes and close his eyes. Relax. And then you have the wife begin to visualize what it's going to be like when her dear husband dies. And she cannot afford to bury him. And what life on the mean streets is going to be like when she can't afford a funeral. And even that dear pastor of hers and the dear rabbi cannot afford a pauper's burial. Well, as you can imagine, it took only a matter of mere minutes before the poor, frantic wife begins to impose on her increasingly irritated husband, who by this time would do about anything to get rid of Richard, including tossing Aunt Mabel into the deal for good measure, she who had been estranged from the family for years. Boundaries. We are all taught from a tender age they are healthy, a necessary sort of mental ball to somehow keep us in check. One of Richard's greatest charms was that he did not cross boundaries. Rather, he seemed to float over them effortlessly, as though they did not exist at all. He was a Jew who went to synagogue on high holidays and went to Mass with Jenny on Sundays. He counted both rabbis and priests among the closest of his friends. Richard's ability to get away with schemes, behavior, and comments that at the very least could land the rest of us an overnight stay in jail was not only due to his incredibly charming and convincing manner, but also because his primary target when setting up a crowd for the fall was doing things outside the standard, and Richard would inject boring here, rules of etiquette without ever knowingly causing offense made us laugh at ourselves as well as the great absurdity of what we so unquestioningly accept as sacrosanct. Labor Day weekend of 2007, Richard suffered a serious stroke, destroying the retina of his left eye, leaving him forever blind in that eye. The timing of the stroke coincided with his high school class reunion at Cheltenham High School. His class members had a reunion every 5 years, and he and good friend Ken Lutz were the perennial MCs. This particular year, Ken couldn't make it because his daughter happened to be getting married. Now, anybody else would have been pleading too debilitated to go to the reunion, let alone MC it, given the circumstances. But then again, we're talking about Richard Klein here. He who had never turned down the opportunity to be the center of attention, even if he had just suffered a catastrophic stroke. So, the week prior to the reunion, Ginny went to Kinko's Daily and had the script of his comments enlarged to the point that, in Richard's words, they were down to about 1 letter per page, and the script looked more like the Manhattan telephone directory than the copy of my address. When Ginny and he got up on stage, Richard said, "I have 2 announcements to make. First of all, this is not Kenny Lux in drag, but my wife, Virginia. And secondly, I had a stroke in my left eye, which is why I look like Marty Feldman in Young Frankenstein with bulging eyes. So if I flood my lines, you will understand." He then went on to poke fun at all of his other aging classmates' infirmities as much as he did his own. At one point, in as serious a tone as he could muster, he said, "As you know, our fellow classmate and dear friend Alvin Waxman recently lost a leg. Would everybody please look under your table for Alvin's leg?" Richard Klein had an exquisite eye for beauty, and this extended to the finer attributes of women, Ginny, of course, being the most beautiful of all. Richard, as we all know, was not shy about sharing his perceptions of a woman's endowments publicly with whomever, including priests, little old ladies, etc., often much to Virginia's distress, her soft mantra often being, "Please don't embarrass me, Richard, please don't embarrass me." Anyway, Richard, Virginia, and I were invited to a mutual friend's wedding in Detroit a few years ago. Now, this friend happened to have been the former Miss Michigan, and Richard was not all that keen about going to the wedding until he found out that she had invited no less than 26 former, current, and former contestants to the wedding. Well, a moving locomotive could not have stopped him from going to the wedding at that point. On the day of the wedding, we arrived a bit late and were seated in the very last pew. Virginia immediately knelt and began praying. Richard, on the other hand, was fidgeting like crazy, wringing his hand, craning his neck, looking this way and that. "What is the matter with you?" I whispered. "Can we move up?" he asked. "No," I answered. "The ceremony is about to begin. And besides, the church is packed. For God's sake, Richard. You would think you were a member of the family or something, the way you're acting. What's up with you?" "What's up?" he asked incredulously. "What's up? How many Miss Americas did you say were invited to this?" 26 or something, I said. "Look behind you and tell me what you see," he said. "A wall," I answered. "Exactly," he said. Just what am I supposed to look at during the ceremony? Their backs? That's Richard. Richard's existence defied boundaries, and this extended to his rich and varied career. During the course of his lifetime, he managed to accomplish more than most could in 10 lifetimes. I will hit just upon a few of the highlights because to list everything that Richard did would take all day and possibly all night too. And I promised Paul that I would end this speech in less than 3 days. He created the very successful and hot-selling second-generation Slinky toys, including the Slinky Caterpillar, the Slinky Googly-Eyed Glasses, and Slinky Train. He spun a PR story for clients, making it appear that the Kansas City athletic baseball team was considering a move to New Jersey, momentarily turning the entire sports world upside down, including one Howard Cosell. Marketed landmark counterculture documentaries for the Film Group of Chicago, including Cicero March and the Murder of Fred Hampton. Established successful gallery video theaters in Chicago and Milwaukee, featuring Group 2, which among its other stars included a young Chevy Chase. Created a popular line of some of the first ever, if not the first ever, sound greeting cards featuring prominent recording stars Johnny Cash, Tony Bennett, and the new Crispy Minstrels. Produced the Captain Zoom personalized Happy Birthday record in collaboration with Joan Rivers and Rod McEwen, some of the biggest selling singles of all time, selling over 40 million copies. I think it's probably above that now. Served as one of the pioneers of the A&E network and was the creative force behind the Dr. Ruth Show. And in the 1980s, Richard recognized a golden opportunity to convert the universal newsreels housed at the Smithsonian Institute, where his sister Nancy worked as head docent for commercial purposes. He raised the venture capital required for copying the newsreel and eventually sold the licensing right for millions of feet of news features to most of the news networks as well as the BBC, allowing them to establish their own historical archives. And I could go on and on. Richard once said, he never really had to hold a job. His work was devoted to pursuing ideas, and his ideas were guided by his unshakable belief that if you simply follow your passion, success will surely follow. For Richard Klein, living within boundaries would have confined him to a life of mediocrity, and Richard was anything but. Richard's love for his friends and family was without bounds. When we finally reached the epilogue of the book, I thought we were basically done. Little did I know. Richard wanted to make sure to express his love and admiration for practically everyone he had met along life's path. When we got to about page 5 or 6 of the epilogue, my literary sensibilities began to be offended. In exasperation, I said, Richard, epilogues are supposed to be short. Most of your chapters are only 1 to 3 pages long. At the rate we're going, this epilogue is going to be as long as the whole rest of your book. Richard looked up at me, defiance showing in his eyes, and said, good. Whose book is it anyway? And while you're at it, bold everybody's name we use. I don't want anybody to miss mention of their name. Ah, Richard. He who was so devoid of an understanding of boundaries, because in the end, I finally grasped what Richard had known all along, that it was his friends and his family, and most of all, his dear angel Jimmy, that kept him firmly and lovingly tethered to the confines of this mortal life.